Welcome back to another Fundamentals Friday. So in the past Fundamentals Fridays, we've already discussed a couple of important features like line weight and how to draw folds. Sticking with the theme of the character design idea, I think the next logical step that might level up your drawings quite massively is going to be focusing on how we can actually convey texture and form with just a bare minimum of lines that we can come up with. So that's what this video is going to be all about. Let's get into it. So in theory, it's actually not too difficult to get an illusion of three-dimensional form with lines, but we need to think about why we put lines down in the first place, because the understanding why you're doing things is always going to be the best way to learn a new principle and to actually remember it when you need to apply it. So why are we using lines? What do lines do for us? Well, lines can do two things. They can create containment, meaning that I can actually use them to create a bounding box around a specific part of my drawing. So for example, for all of these cylinders, we can very clearly see where the top part and the front part is because we have contained the top parts of my cylinder with a line. If that line wouldn't be there, then I wouldn't know what the difference was between the top and the front. So we are using it for containment. Now, aside from containment, it's also being used to sort of accentuate our three-dimensional form. So defining form or describing form is actually another interesting use for our lines. Now, sticking to the containment bit, we'll get to these cylinders in a second. Sticking to the containment bit, we can actually see with these cubes, for example, that these are quite sharp transitions. Like we're literally turning a 90-degree angle away from each other. So we have a top-facing plane and a front-facing plane and a side-facing plane. So that's quite a sharp change of angle, which is why we are using a very prominent and thick line to kind of describe that feature. But from the moment we are actually consciously trying to soften perhaps that edge, like let's say I'm actually sort of creating a little bit of a bevel, cutting off the corner, we can see that that transition is now has literally halved in how intense that transition is, and an equally bold line will just start becoming a little bit distracting. So we need to adjust the way we are using our lines in this case to show that this is actually a softer transition between my top plane, my intermediate plane in this case, and my side plane. So how can we soften our lines? Well, it's either quite literally just put down a softer, like a thinner line, so that we have something that's less distracting, or alternatively, you can also choose to just not completely fill out the line. Maybe we'll be satisfied with just the start and the end of the line, and that's enough for me to know more about that transition and how that's actually looking. So that's an interesting way to in that first stage insinuate that it's a bit more of a softer transition. And if we actually move on to perhaps doing that again, we can actually see, okay, what happens if I keep softening that transition? So we had our first bevel, and we intersected it basically with just this one little sidebar that we have. But we can do that again and again and again until we actually have a fairly rounded edge. So let's see if we can actually come up with that, and we can sort of start rounding off this edge in a way where we are getting to a point where that transition is actually almost barely noticeable. Well, now it starts becoming a bit more of a challenge to still contain that side plane, right? Because now it's such a soft transition that a full line would just be too distracting to use. So again, knowing what kind of line to use and what kind of line not to use, in this case, is actually the core principle that we're using to figure out which lines or what type of lines that we actually want to put down. And for the sake of brevity, I'm just sort of going to soften this into like a proper just curve. Now we can see that these lines are actually still there, and those are actually doing a pretty decent job at describing that form. And we can also see like what would happen if I would just get rid of this. Well, without that transition, it does feel perhaps a little bit empty. So what can we do to describe the form in this case? Well, we're not going to be using any sort of continuous line, because all lines that we put down that are like completely going from one end to the other are going to be too noisy, too loud, and not going to show off that three-dimensional nature that we actually require. So what can we do? We can once again start using perhaps just those random lines that we maybe saw some people in comic books do in the past, and see like we can figure out why they would actually place them. So having these, for example, be broken up allows me to know that that's not a sharp transition between the front and the side plane and the top plane. It just indicates at the fact that there is some kind of transition happening there. Another thing that we can do is, instead of just going along with the lines, we can actually go across them as well. So these cross contour lines perhaps start becoming quite important. So following the edges that we have and sort of hatching in some of these softer curves would also help showing off perhaps some of those transitions in a way that we can actually accentuate that three-dimensional nature. So this is already a first idea of how to describe form, and it doesn't matter where you want to do this. You can also do that in the side plane, for example. It's always going to be the same idea. I just sort of want to be very suggestive with the lines that I put down. I don't want to have too many of them. I don't want to have too bold of them, because from the moment one actually stands out like that, suddenly feels like it's a sharp transition, like a harsh transition, which isn't the case for the sort of rounded edge that we're making. Also, the shorter that rounded edge is, so still the sharper it is, the more dense perhaps these lines will have to be to kind of indicate that this is still going to be a fairly sharp transition, you know. So using this information to, in addition to what we'll be discussing now, is going to bring us to creating these kind of textures that we can actually start using in our character designs. So for example, all of these textures are potential textures that I'd use for something like maybe like a medieval knight kind of character, right? Like we have our wood for the handle of an axe. We have just a random three-dimensional texture. We have scale mail, different types of scale mail actually, maybe some chain mail, maybe some more dragon-like scales. We have a gambeson padding. We have perhaps something that's a bit more like of a rough fabric, like a wool, and an interwoven fabric. And all of these are actually using the same principle to get to the point where they actually feel quite nice to look at and quite believable. And the whole idea behind this is, like, if you imagine we take a cross-section of this blue cylinder over here that has a little bit of roughness, a little bit of texture to it, we can actually imagine that if we take a cross-section and we're looking at it from the front, we do get to see like why it is that these lines perhaps are closer towards the edge of the silhouette and more widespread towards the front of the silhouette, because it's basically the way we're looking at these bumps. We can see the front and the side of the bumps that are all the way at the middle of the cylinder. Like imagine we're looking from there, and the ones that are getting closer and closer to the side, we can only see like the front bit, and perhaps the back is sometimes hidden, which means that we can actually see the edge of these individual ripples. Now our lines, as we know, are being used to contain form, contain shape. So that means if I'm seeing the edge of one of these little ripples, I actually want to show that, and the more prominent that edge is, the more defined my line is going to be. So once again, the same idea that we used earlier, just a thick line for if we see a full edge, and the more or the less we see of that edge, and the less that edge is prominent, the less thick of a line we're going to use, and how the less connected our lines are going to be. So combining that with the fact that our lines are more dense at the side of our silhouette and more open at the center of our silhouette will immediately help us give a little bit more of a sense of depth to something that otherwise would feel fairly two-dimensional. And that's the same idea essentially for all of these. Like if we actually take a look at these and sort of break down why it is or what's happening and why it is that these are actually working quite nicely, once again we can sort of see that these lines to the side are actually quite a lot denser together, and the more we get towards the center, the more spaced out they're going to be, which is exactly the same principle as we were describing earlier. For these ones as well, denser together to the side and more spread out at the center. And that's again the same principle that we are using. So for all of these, it's the same idea. The one thing that we do need to keep in mind with these kind of textures as well is not only the lines that are going across the with the form, but also the lines that are going across the form. because obviously we need to follow the perspective. So that means that edge of my cylinder is going to be looping around my entire cylinder, and that's going to give me a sense of direction for where these scales are actually going to have to go. So imagine we want to apply some of these textures perhaps to a very simple mannequin like this, and this is actually an exercise that I'd recommend you do if you want to explore like playing around with how to add form and texture to perhaps more simple subjects. So a mannequin like this gives us a very solid foundation. We know what the three-dimensional form is that we need to describe. Now we just basically almost need to just drag and drop these textures that we have over here on top of our mannequin that we have over here as well. So the first thing that I'd like to do is to basically create a separation of which material goes where. We can use some of these perhaps as inspiration of what we want to do, and in this case, you know, it doesn't even have to become a character. It can be rather nonsensical, but assuming that it's a character, just perhaps indicating the fact that we have almost like a collar, like a shirt-esque thing wrapping around. We can use those lines that we have put down on the mannequin as a guideline for where that logically would have to go. And perhaps we can start thinking about, okay, which bits of the mannequin will get which texture. So using these guidelines, let's see if we can actually give this guy perhaps a bit more of like a gambeson vest that's kind of wrapping around over here. Now the gambeson is obviously, we have these squares, and the first step that we'd have to take is to actually figure out all of the cross contour lines. And in this case, I like to start out with visualizing the spacing of how far apart these patches, these strips of that material are basically going to be spaced apart. So 4 layers should do the trick, and we can then move on to thinking about where we are going to go with our vertical lines. And again, the idea of having them more close together as we get closer to the silhouette, and having them closer to the edge of the silhouette and more spread apart as we get towards the center of our silhouette is a good starting point to make sure that we are still, you know, sticking with something that at least represents our three-dimensional nature of our mannequin correctly. Now we can start getting into the actual texture. So for the sake of clarity, I'll just grab this one, move it over here so we have it very close as reference. And we know that the gambeson texture has a three-dimensionality to it itself anyway. So we have these cushions that are breaking through. And I'm not thinking about the actual costume design aspects yet. I'm just thinking about showing off this particular material for this particular form. I'm not worrying about the costume and the seams and what needs to fit in where. That's a whole different subject. As long as I get something that approaches the material of a gambeson, I'm content, I'm satisfied. So as you can see, everything that we've discussed earlier is actually quite nicely represented here, and that combined with perhaps some of the line weight knowledge that you've gathered from watching the line weight video on the channel here as well, gets us to a point where we have a fairly nice and believable looking material and looking texture. So the main idea is, once again, we're looking at it from a top-down view. So which edges are going to be mostly defined for each cushion? Well, in this case, it's going to be the outside edge and the bottom edge. Because we're looking at it from top-down, we can see the bulge of it kind of poking its belly forward. So the lower edge is actually more important than the top edge for these cushions. So that is giving us a fairly clear sense of direction on which lines that should need emphasizing and which lines that actually maybe are better left a little bit more suggestive. And a good test is also to kind of see if I start erasing from this, does it actually make a big impact on the readability? And I'd say I can actually get away perhaps with even less lines. One of the main things that I think is interesting in learning how to draw is at some point it's not necessarily the fact that you need to learn how to draw something, it's that you need to learn which lines that you shouldn't be putting down. So not which lines matter, but actually the lines that don't matter, and that we can kind of sift away, like sift through our process. So we basically streamline the entire thing, allow ourselves to even put in slightly less effort in a sense, because we are taking less time refining every single detail. So we can put away his coat for now, and we can actually see if perhaps we can turn this guy into a little bit of a wooden doll, and figure out what kind of impact that might have on the way we're going to make this look a bit more readable. So once again, it's the same process. We know that we have these lines that are closer together, but in this case, we don't have a bit more of an organic pattern. We don't necessarily have that strict grid that our Gambison material, our padded material had. So how do we actually go about, in that case, figuring out where to put which lines? Well, the good thing is, since it's organic, we actually have a lot more leeway with the mistakes that we can make, as long as we still keep in mind that our lines should be closer together the further they are away towards the silhouette. Then I think we can still get away with quite a lot. So for example, having that wooden texture, like that grain of perhaps like something like a tree trunk or something bark-like, is something that we can actually, with a couple of lines only, start insinuating. We don't need that many lines. Every so often you might have at the center like a little bit more of a deeper crack, which is something that we can put in, just to kind of make sure that we are keeping things interesting and varied. But aside from the really deep cracks, we don't necessarily need that much information at the center of our tree bark material. And as you can see, fairly quickly, like real time, this probably took me about 2 minutes to do, we actually get something that represents that bark texture. And even if we would want to take this to the next level, we can start thinking about, okay, how can I maybe turn this into maybe like a woodland creature? Because technically, like, the same thing applies. Like if I would want to actually turn these into something like branches, for example, I just sort of have to make sure that the grain is actually sort of merging with the structure that I've already laid down. But aside from that, it's really the same idea of having those lines just be a bit closer towards the edges. And it just helps for such a easy and believable way to kind of get that three-dimensional flow, like that three-dimensional nature in your designs. That three-dimensionality is the last thing that we want to compromise in our line art. So all of the lines that we put down should be there to emphasize basically these 3D forms that we don't want to get lost. And just for fun, we can see what happens when we actually dress this guy up in the Gambison. So here's an example of how we can actually apply this on a real character. This is a character that I designed for my D&D campaign, and I applied just the techniques that we discussed earlier today for how I would actually address the Gambison and the chainmail. So the chainmail, same idea. We try to follow the curves of the folds, and we make sure that we actually, at the moment we start rounding something off, maybe just start compiling those lines a little bit closer together, so we get that feeling like it's a really, really rounded feature. And you can do this throughout the entire design. The principles remain the same, so it's all just kind of rinse and repeat, and from the moment you kind of get the hang of this, it becomes very easy to translate this to different materials, like in this case the Gambison. So the Gambison, same technique that we discussed earlier, plan out a bit of a grid of where these need to go according to the dimensions of the third dimension of the character that you're trying to design, and make sure it's actually wrapping around the curves of the silhouette as well. Like, that's the most important bit. The tricky thing about a Gambison is that those pads actually have volume themselves, so you actually need to make sure that you keep that into account as well. But for the most part, again, if you follow the steps, it's going to be fairly simple to get this going. Now, obviously, anything takes some practice, so we definitely want to make sure that we get to a point where we're comfortable with this. So slowing down, we can actually go into this perhaps real time to show you exactly how I would go through adding texture to perhaps some of these pieces of these costumes. So like, for example, I would like to include a little bit of chainmail, and you've already seen me attempt this in the last demonstration, but the idea is so simple. It is mainly just like I'm quickly hatching in these curved lines along with the form of the head. And I'm just making sure that as I get closer, again, towards the edge of the silhouette, that these lines are just a little bit more dense and a little bit more pronounced. Now, the difficult thing is we also need to keep in mind the individual form of the folds, etc. So that means that in certain areas, actually, we might actually want to have a couple of these pieces of these chain links, basically, that are a little bit more defined. So from the moment I get towards these kind of areas where I have sort of the hood folding over, I actually might want to accentuate some of these chain links a little bit more, so it at least hints at the fact that I have that object turning away from the viewer, basically. So that's a general idea. We can definitely keep things rather suggestive. We don't have to go very in detail, like you can do this fairly quickly. Try not to cramp your wrist too much when you're doing this, so being loose and quick hits is kind of the main message. But having these accentuated lines along these folds really helps with just the overall readability of the drawing. The fun thing is also, you can sketch in those fold lines before you actually move on to the chain links, but you can use them as reference really clearly for that next step. So it's actually a really valuable idea to sort of spend some extra time in those early stages and make sure that you are actually thinking about the 3D form at all times. And you can do this layer by layer to make sure that you're also really following those cross contour lines, basically. So another fun thing you can do is, obviously we already have made quite a lot of leaps just by adding that texture. It feels definitely a lot more refined, a lot more finished. But now what we can do is we can actually start thinking about perhaps some of the imperfections. Maybe when there's a little bit more of a crevice between some of the chain links. Maybe when there's even one completely missing, and we can just sort of start adding a little bit more randomness to the design by just kind of accentuating almost like a path that we like to use to kind of lead the eye the way that we want. So a little bit of randomness in the pattern that might feel a little bit too clean and rigid will definitely help, especially since, this is a goblin and they maybe tend to have less fancy equipment that might be a little bit faulty, might even not be like fully functional. So that's definitely something we can indicate with just a couple of imperfections in the chain links, and I think that does add a lot to just the overall believability of a drawing like this. So for something like fur, we can actually do a very, very similar thing where we basically compile the plucks of hair that we have closer towards that area where it's actually transitioning the fastest, where it's really turning away from the viewer, right? So from us in this case. So we actually just want to layer a bunch of these plucks of hair and these hair lines, so to speak, close towards the edge of that silhouette, in this case of these individual forms. Like for the legs, for example, you can see how that already kind of starts adding a little bit of extra three-dimensionality, but even for stuff like a belly that's slightly overlapping with the back leg, we can even just have like a couple of lines that are basically doing the same thing. So it's a lot of fun to just sort of figure out which lines you can afford to leave in, which lines we can afford to leave out, in order to create the most appealing version of this drawing. So it's a very important skill to learn how to distribute your line work, as to not turn your drawing into something that's overly complicated, but you still need to focus on like having enough readability of that three-dimensional form. And it's basically all just sort of individual plucks of hair overlapping, and where we have the most of these plucks overlapping, so when the form is turning away from us, that's where we want to add a little bit more line work. So as you can see, the final result is actually quite interesting. Like I feel like we've definitely made quite a leap from just the drawing, which I already liked at first, to you know this more refined drawing that already has some texture. And obviously, if we would want to take this one step further and we'd get into painting, like a lot of this detail would have to go, but it does still give us a very good sense of direction of where we would actually make our brush marks, even if we want to transition into that more complicated nature of creating the painting. So in this case, this is actually just the first step, the foundation that you'd often see underneath a final painting, because again, it just helps us with getting a very, very clear foundation that is very easy to work with. We have all of the information here, so the next step is actually quite easy. Now, if you just like drawing, well, obviously you can just leave it at this. Don't even have to add color, and it's quite a lot of fun. And obviously, traditionally is also really, really fun to just grab a fine liner and get to sketching. Like I personally practice this sort of thing in my sketchbook more often than digitally. So that's definitely something I would recommend to you guys if this is something that you'd like to practice in the future. So if you want more information about any other subjects rather than what we're discussing during these Fundamental Fridays, of course, there's still the Brush Sauce Studio, the Brush Sauce Academy. You can definitely find what you need on the website, because there's a lot of information there that's very, very useful. So at least for this Fundamental Friday, that's going to be it. If you guys have any more questions or suggestions on what we should cover in the future, let me know. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something new. And well, I'll see you guys in a future video. Take care.